Hey everybody, thank you for joining me here tonight. Before anything, I want to say a special happy Father's Day to all you fathers out there that might be watching, whether you've been a father for a long time or whether you're a new father or maybe you're a fatherly presence to somebody. I hope that you've had a good Father's Day. I hope you've gotten a chance to enjoy the day. Hope that you were in a good Bible-based church for service, whether it was our church or another church. I hope that you have somewhere to be. But I appreciate you being here. Tonight's message, being Father's Day, I'm going to be talking about a fatherly influence. More specifically, as I put down, a God-fearing fatherly influence. And I put that word influence in there because this is open to not just the biological father, because everybody has a biological father, but I'm talking about also that God-fearing fatherly influence that we have in life, that we need in life. Mother's Day, I always think about how, yes, I have a mother and I have a stepmother, but I've also had other women in my life that have been a motherly influence, and Father's Day is really no different. Yes, I have a father, I have a stepfather, but I've also had other fatherly influences. I've had other men in my life that are not my biological father, but have had fatherly-like influences on me, whether it was correcting me when I was wrong or giving me sage advice or just being a soundboard, someone that I could talk to get a different opinion or to seek some wise counsel. So this story from the Bible, I hope, will illustrate just how important that God-fearing fatherly influence is. Proverbs 1:8 says, "My son, hear the instruction of your father." Hear the instruction of your father. And that comes from Solomon in the book of Proverbs. And in the next verse, or in the previous verse, it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So we need God-fearing fatherly influences in our lives. They are incredibly important, whether you're at the age where you need it as a young man or whether you're an older gentleman, maybe in your 30s or 40s or 50s, and you have the opportunity to be that God-fearing fatherly influence to someone, whether it's kids at your church or at your small group or in the neighborhood, on someone's sports team, whatever it may be, in the proper capacity. And before I dive too deep, I want to pray real quick. Father God, thank you so much for the gift of your word. God, thank you that you are a good, good Father. It is who you are, and I am so thankful for that. And I'm also thankful, Lord, for the men, the God-fearing men that you have placed in my life, both as my biological father, my stepfather, but also the other fatherly influences, the men who have watched over me and have guided me and corrected me and directed me, Father, throughout my whole life. So I'm incredibly thankful for them, thankful for you for blessing me with them. And I just humbly pray that this message tonight would just glorify and just further illustrate just how important a God-fearing fatherly influence is. So I thank you so much, Father, for all that you do. Thank you for the gift of your word and the chance to preach it. In Jesus' name, amen. So I come up with a few things. There's three things that a God-fearing fatherly influence, what adds up to that. First and foremost, you got to have a father's love. A father can't just be just that person that is just straight punishment. You got to have a father's love. Psalm 103:13, the psalmist says, "As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him." As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. So you got to have that father's love. Not just being the hard egg all the time. There's also in that equation father's love plus discipline based on God's standard, which I like to refer to as something that's higher than a human standard. Human standards, in case you're living under a rock, human standards for what is considered normal, what is considered good, what is considered right, they're in a constant state of flux because human standards change. Human standards they change based on emotions, or they change based on feelings. They get changed based on what culture says is what is right and wrong. So we need to have discipline based on God's standards to help make a God-fearing fatherly influence. Proverbs 3:12 says, "Whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as a father the son in whom he delights." Whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as a father the son in whom he delights. So you got to have that discipline that is based on God's standard. It is the only perfect standard. And the third thing of the equation to make a God-fearing fatherly influence is you got to be able to provide godly guidance. I'm not saying you got to be God, because you're not God, but you got to be able to provide guidance in a godly way. More in mind than just self when it comes to this guidance. A lot of people can guide your child or a person into these things that are not good for them, but they serve a self purpose. We have to be able to provide godly guidance. Proverbs 11:14 says, "Where there is no counsel, the people fall." So that counsel is like a version of providing guidance. Where there is no counsel, the people fall. Where there is no counsel, no godly kind of guidance as a father, the children fall apart, the home falls apart, really. So you need a father's love, discipline based on God's standard, and you also need to be able to provide godly guidance. And that, you total all up, to me, comes up to a God-fearing fatherly influence. You don't have to be the biological father to provide these things. You might be grandpa, you might be uncle, you might just be a fellow at the church, or it doesn't matter, godfather, whatever term you want to use that's not biological father. You don't have to just be, blood to be able to provide these things. There was a country song that came out some time ago that was kind of like aimed towards stepfathers, and it was like, at one point in the song, the guy said, he ain't my blood, but he's my boy, and you correct them and you train them up in that way, even if they're not your biological son. One of the best examples of this I found, there's so many places you can go in the Bible as far as a Father's Day message, but I chose to go to Exodus. The main place we're going to be is in Exodus chapter 18, second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus, chapter number 18. But I'm really going to get going here in chapter number 2. So in chapter number 2 of Exodus, most people probably more well know this second chapter as being where we are introduced to Moses for the first time. Chapter 2 is where Moses is born. He's born of a man of the house of Levi and took a wife as a daughter. He is born at the time the Pharaoh of Egypt is... they're killing babies left and right. They need to decrease the population. Moses' mother puts him basically in this basket, floats him down the river to keep him safe. He's discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. Things continue on, and in chapter 2 is also where Moses realizes that he's not an Egyptian. He is a Hebrew, and his people are slaves, and he ends up killing an Egyptian, and then out of fear of being found out that he killed an Egyptian, he escapes into the wilderness. And this is all taking place before the burning bush when God comes to speak to Moses. And in chapter number 2, verse 16, we get introduced to the man who will eventually become Moses' father-in-law. His name is Jethro. In chapter number 2, verse 16, I'll just scoot through it real quick. In 2:16 it says, "Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to Reuel," for some reason, sometimes in the Bible people have multiple different names, but this Reuel is the Jethro we're going to speak of. "When they came to Reuel, their father, they said, 'How is it that you have come so soon today?'" Talking about his daughters that had gone to get water. And they said, "An Egyptian, Moses, delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and he also drew enough water for us and watered the flocks." So he said to his daughters, "And where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." And he invites Moses into his house. Moses did a good deed helping his family out. Jethro had 7 daughters. So Moses had helped them out. He was just doing a good deed at the well. Verse 21 says, "Then Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah his daughter to Moses." So not only does Moses get invited over to the house and he ends up living with Jethro, but he ends up marrying one of his daughters, Zipporah. So all this is happening. And then a little bit later on down the road, in chapter number 3 of Exodus, this is when God comes calling to Moses. God has heard the cries of his people, the Israelites. They are in slavery and bondage. And in chapter number 3, Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he had led the flock back to the desert, and the burning bush happens, and God calls out to Moses and basically like, hey, this is what you're going to do. You're going to go back. I've seen my people. They're in distress. They're in slavery. Basically, Moses is the one that's getting called to go get them. So Moses hears the call from God at the burning bush. He even tries to talk his way out of it a little bit, but he eventually just kind of takes it on. And actually, in chapter number 4, verse 18, this is one of the first places where you see just how much of a godly influence and a godly man that Jethro was. Moses was married to one of Jethro's daughters. That's his son-in-law. He's married to one of his daughters, so Jethro's got to be, kind of sort of keeping an eye on him a little bit. Moses has heard this call from God, and Jethro was a priest of Midian, so he's a godly man. In verse 18 of chapter number 4, it says, So Moses went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, after he'd gotten this call from God, Please let me go and return to my brethren who are in Egypt, the Hebrews, and see whether they are still alive. Now, at this point, Jethro could have been like, looky here, man. I don't want to hear about no burning bush. You're married to my daughter. You've got kids by my daughter. You need to take care of that. I don't care about no burning bush. But Jethro was a godly man. Jethro had to have known this is not just some made-up thing. This is the real deal. It says in verse 18, it says, And Jethro said to Moses, Go in peace. Jethro recognizes this is a call from God. Go in peace. So he gives him that endorsement. And like I said, I've reiterated this several times. Jethro's not Moses' father. He's not his blood father. He's just his father-in-law. Moses had a father. He was a man of the tribe of Levi. His name was Amram. If you're curious about him, he pops up in Exodus chapter 6, verse 20. Moses' parents are God-fearing parents. They're actually mentioned in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter number 11, verse 23. So if you want to look that up for yourself. Moses doesn't come from some crazy background, some godless background. He comes from God-fearing parents. That's why he's even still alive, because his parents feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. That's why they kept him alive and didn't allow for him to be killed. But nevertheless, so we've been introduced to Jethro. We know who Jethro is. Jethro is Moses' father-in-law. So after he hears this call, Moses sends his wife and his kids back with Jethro, because Moses has got to go get the Israelites out of Egypt. And the Exodus takes place. They come out of Egypt, and a lot of things are happening before we get to chapter number 18. And just to kind of sum things up a little bit, the Red Sea has parted. Moses has, through the power of God put into him, he has parted the Red Sea for these people. They've come through. They've seen the Egyptians smashed on the rocks and drowned. Israelites complaining about not having no water. God has told Moses how to make the bitter waters made sweet. Bread is rained down from heaven, the manna coming to feed the children of Israel. They've gone through a battle. They battled the Amalekites and won, because they were having to prop Moses' arm up, because as his hands were raised, the victory would ensue for the Israelites, and if his hands dropped, they began to lose the battle. So a lot of things have been happening. Moses he's got a lot going on. He's God's man, but he's got a lot of things going on. These Israelites are complaining all the time. And we get to chapter number 18 of Exodus and this is where we're going to really key in on just how important that God-fearing fatherly influence is in a man's life. It's even a man like Moses. Moses is just glowing from how much God is in him. How much he is feeling. I mean, he is performing these incredible miracles. God is allowing him to perform these incredible miracles, these amazing things, making food appear up off the ground, being able to throw a limb of a tree into a pond and make it drinkable water, parting the Red Sea, so many things. But he's got all these people behind him, and he's just got pressure on him. His father-in-law is not going to add to that pressure. His father-in-law is going to provide God-fearing fatherly influence. So in Exodus chapter number 18 is when these two are going to be reunited. Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people. that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt in verse 2. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back with her 2 sons. So they're basically going to meet up now. Moses has got his people out of Egypt, and Jethro is going to bring his daughter, Moses' wife, and family, out to go meet him, out to be with him. And in verses 7 through 12 is kind of going to be the first thing I key in here. So verse number 7 is where we start. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down and kissed him. That was a typical form of an embrace. Bowed down and kissed him, and they asked each other about their well-being, and they went into the tent. So they get caught up, they love each other, they acknowledge each other, they ask each other about their well-being, and they went into the tent to get caught up. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. Then Jethro rejoiced for all the good which the Lord had done for Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Verse 11, Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. This is Jethro talking. For in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them. Verse 12, Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and other sacrifices to offer to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So just in verses 7 through 12, we see more of the God-fearing fatherly influence that Jethro had over his son-in-law, over Moses. I mean, that would have been a pretty cool thing to brag about. Like, who's your son-in-law? Oh, he's that guy over there. I mean, he's about as useful as a wagon wheel. Who's your son-in-law? Moses, the guy leading us out of this whole thing. God's man. That's my son-in-law. But here's what Jethro does here in verses 7 through 12. I'll point it out to you. In verse number 9, Jethro rejoices. A father-in-law, a fatherly influence that is willing and is so on fire for God and just worshiping God, period, rejoicing God. Verse 9, Then Jethro rejoiced. After Moses had told him everything that had happened, Jethro rejoiced for all the good which the Lord had done for Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hands of the Egyptians. He's not one of those fatherly influences that just goes, well, that was nice. No, my man, rejoicing what God had done. In verse 10, he gives credit to God. He gives open credit to God in front of his son-in-law. Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Blessed be the Lord. That's a form of Jethro not giving credit to Moses. Moses was doing what he was told to do, but recognizing, man, blessed be the Lord for these amazing things that he has done. This is all God's work right here. That's what a God-fearing fatherly influence does. It's not sitting there giving you undue credit or giving the world undue credit. Like, well, I mean, I guess it had to happen eventually. No, man. Rejoicing in God and giving credit to God. In verse 11, he worships God. In verse 11, he says, Now I know that the Lord, being the God of Israel, now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them. You got to remember, in these times, just like in modern times, people tried to come up with all different kind of versions of gods. You had a whole lot of fake false gods, these idols that people had. Too many to name per se in the Bible, but nevertheless, you had all these different things that people tried to claim was a god, or all these false gods. What does Jethro do? God-fearing fatherly influence in Moses' life. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. An open acknowledgement. Sometimes I think it's very unfortunate, but I know a lot of people whose father or their fatherly influences in their life, they don't acknowledge God in any kind of way. I mean, they're good men. They try to be good men and hold to a good standard, but they don't worship God. I think a lot of kids I know myself included, if I see a parent doing it, I'm a lot more apt to do it. If I see a parent worshiping God, serving God, being willing to serve in the church or minister, if you will, it's sure as heck going to make it a lot easier for me to go out and do it because I've seen a parent do it. It's one of the things that I've got, upcoming when my son comes along. I got to show my son that we give God the credit for everything. God is the one that is in control. We worship the God of Israel. He is the same God, like the song we sang the other Sunday. And in verse number 12, he does what he's supposed to do. He offers a burnt offering to God. You got to remember, this is Old Testament times, so you had to offer up offerings. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and other sacrifices to offer to God. This was a form of showing God thankfulness. This is what God was owed. You made a sacrifice. You made an animal sacrifice. Moses' father-in-law took a burnt offering and other sacrifices to offer to God. And Aaron, Moses' brother, came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So offering a burnt offering to God, worshiping God, giving God the credit for this amazing thing that God has done through Moses, providing for the people of Israel, and rejoicing God. I mean, these seem like a bunch of things that I could see someone looking at them and going, "Oh, that's all just a bunch of the same thing." No, it is one thing to pray to God. It is one thing to ask things of God. It is another thing to rejoice in God, to praise God, to worship God, to offer up what is due to God. It's one thing to come and sit in church. It's another thing to come in church and actually put something in the offering plate or give God what the Bible says He is due as far as our tithe and our offering. It's one thing to come and say you're a Christian. It's another thing to stand in church with both hands raised up and just worship God through the song and hear His word preached, hear sermons preached from His word, and to worship God in all things. And that's what Jethro does. Jethro does these things, out in front of his son. Just because he's a priest, he's still a God-fearing fatherly influence, and he is that to Moses. Continuing on in verses 13 through 23, now we're going to see an effect of that God-fearing fatherly influence that Jethro had over his son-in-law, and just how important it was, and just how much Moses needed it. So it's a little bit of reading, so just hang with me. Verse 13, we start. And so it was. Now we've had all that good stuff happen. Now we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of this message. Verse 13. And so it was on the next day after all this, that Moses sat to judge the people. And the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. This is literally people coming before Moses with any kind of dispute they have. Moses was their judge. We think of judges and they got that black robe on and they got the gavel and it's in a court of law, but in this time, Moses was literally settling just all these kinds of different disputes. I'm sure some of them were important, and some of them were probably just dumb stuff, like your homeowners insurance or your homeowners association probably goes through. But I digress. And so it was on the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. I mean, this is all day. This is going on. I got a feeling. I don't think I would have made it. I think I would have wanted like at least a lunch break or like, man, can we just do this half the day and have the other half the day? But anyway. So when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did for the people, he said, "What is this thing that you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit and all the people stand before you from morning until evening?" And Moses said to his father-in-law, in verse 15, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one and another, and I make known the statutes of God and His laws." Moses has not been given the Ten Commandments yet. So the law is basically, at this time, it's basically coming straight through him because he's the man standing between the people and God. So in verses 13 through 16, all Jethro does is basically ask, like, what are you doing? What is this thing that you're doing? What is this thing that you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit and all the people stand before you from morning until evening? He observes a flaw in Moses' work. Was Moses doing a good thing? Yes, he was doing a good thing. But can you imagine all those people? I mean, that's millions of people. You got one guy, Moses, that's having to judge all these disputes. If you only had, can you imagine living in a city and there only being one policeman or one firefighter or one EMT to handle all these people and all their problems that pop up, much less a judge? Because in this situation, these people are bringing all these disputes. You got one guy to do it. So Jethro recognizes there's a flaw in the situation. It's not that Moses is doing something wrong, but it's too much for him to take on. So in verses 17 through 22, we're going to see him offer a solution. In verse 17, it says, so Moses' father-in-law, after Moses had said this thing, says, the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one and another, and I make known the statutes of God and his laws. So Jethro is going to come back here in verse 17. So Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you do is not good. The thing that you do is not good. Both you and these people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out. For this thing is too much for you. You are not able to perform it by yourself. You got to remember, Moses is by himself, and this Aaron ain't doing this stuff. This is just Moses. For this thing is too much for you. You are not able to perform it by yourselves. He's willing to tell Moses what probably no one else would have told him. Maybe his wife would have told him, but there's not record of her speaking up. This is Jethro saying, you can't do all this. This is too much for you. You're going to wear yourself out, and you're going to wear these people out. So he comes in verse 19. Listen now to my voice. I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. This isn't just Jethro speaking out of Jethro's mind. You can tell he's got some God behind it. Listen now to my voice, and I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. Here's the advice. Stand before God for the people so that you may bring the difficulties to God. Same thing he was doing, right? And you shall teach them the statutes and the laws. Teach them. Don't just sit there and settle disputes. Teach them the statutes and the laws. Show them the way in which they must walk and the work they must do. So don't just sit there solving disputes left and right. Teach the people what is right and what is wrong, so that they know, hey, you ain't supposed to be doing that. There's murder. You ain't supposed to be doing that. And you shall teach them the statutes and the laws, in verse 20, and show them the way in which they must walk and the work they must do. So tell the people what they're supposed to be doing. People are sheep. You gotta herd sheep. You gotta give them a direction to go. Moreover, further helping the cause. Moreover, verse 21, you shall select from all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, I have a hard time saying that word, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s. And let them judge the people at all times. And let them judge the people at all times. Basically, he's telling him, you're one man trying to do this whole big job. You cannot do it. You're going to wear yourself out, and you're going to wear these people out, and it's going to be ineffective. Basically, in these last two verses I just read, he wants Moses to delegate some responsibility. A sheriff in law enforcement has deputies. He deputizes other men, or other people rather, to represent the sheriff's office. You have deputy sheriffs, but then you also have the head sheriff, and you got policemen underneath him. Just like in the army, the military, anything else, you got your high-ranking officers, but then you got other officers underneath them. There's a chain of command, there's a head honcho, but you delegate responsibility down, because if it's all resting on one man, that's just too much for one person to take on. Let them judge the people at all times. Then, verse 22, we continue on, then it will be that every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they themselves shall judge. So it will be easier for you, for they will bear the burden with you. So he's still saying, hey, you can still handle the big stuff. Moses, you still speak to God on the people's behalf. You still handle the big stuff. But the smaller stuff, but every small matter, they themselves shall judge. And he gave credentials in verse 21. They fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. And so they couldn't just be Johnny on the spots. They had to be the right kind of men. They had to be God-fearing men of truth, that don't covet what other people have. They had to be good people. They had to have this thing. But this is all a part of helping Moses' ministry. Moses has got an incredible ministry. He has got a ton of responsibility. He's got millions of people that are under his wing, that he is walking out in front of on behalf. But every small matter they themselves shall judge, so it will be easier for you, for they will bear the burden with you. If you ever watch, I don't know if you ever watched that sport called rowing, where you got boats, basically like a boat race, but they ain't got no motors on the boats. All they got is people to row the boats. You never see a rowing competition where it's just one guy. You always see a team. You see a team of people together in the rowboat, and they bear the load. Every man carries his load. Every person on the team helps bear a part of the load for the greater good of the team. So that is the advice that Jethro is giving to his son-in-law. And it's God-fearing, fatherly advice. It's not advice that's selfish. If Jethro wanted to be, if he was a conceited man or someone who had a whole bunch of ego, he would have told Moses, hey, don't delegate none of this power out to nobody else. You are God's man to these people. You can handle it. That's not what Jethro did. Jethro recognized the situation and said, hey, you got millions of people. You can't honestly take care of all these people. You're just a man. You're not, that's all you are. You're God's man, but you're just a man. You got to delegate some of this stuff out, or you're going to burn yourself out and you're going to burn these people out. They're already complaining all the daggone time about where are we going to drink, or what are we going to eat, or we could have just, you brought us out here to die. We should have just gone back to Egypt. At least we ate there. All these people, it was a burden for Moses. It really was. He was doing God's work, but sometimes God's people get in the way of someone trying to do God's work. In verse 23, though, is where you get the main reason for doing this. The whole point, the payoff, I like to call it, for everything behind this confidence that Jethro had to stand up and give his son-in-law the advice that no one else probably was brave enough to give him. If you do this thing, delegating the power out, letting these other guys, these other God-fearing men settle the small stuff, and helping them bear the burden. Verse 23, if you do this thing, and God so commands you. I love that Jethro adds this in here, because it's important. You don't just make a decision. The God-fearing fatherly influence doesn't just make a decision out of his own strength. He consults with God. He prays to God. He prays over decisions that he has to make. He still has to go out there and complete actions. He has to stand up and do things, but he takes things before God. He asks God, what do I need to do in these situations? What do I need to do? If you do this thing, verse 23, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure. You, Moses, will be able to endure. And all this people will also go to their place in peace. So not only is this a benefit for Moses, this is a benefit for Moses by doing this thing, by delegating some of this power out and getting some of this stuff off your back. Not only is it going to benefit you so that you will be able to endure, but also for the mass, for the big old mass of Israelites behind him. All this people will also go to their place in peace. Everybody will have their need taken care of, and everything's just going to be a lot better. This is what it needs to be done. And it took a God-fearing, fatherly man, a fatherly influence like Jethro. Moses wasn't his son, he was his son-in-law. But he was strong enough in his conviction, being a God-fearing man that he was, to recognize, you need to get this fixed. This is what you need to be doing it. And he said, if you do this thing and God so commands you, you'll be able to endure. And all this people will also go to their place in peace. And Moses follows the advice. If you read on in verse 24, So Moses heeded the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. And Moses chose able men out of all of Israel and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. So they judged the people at all times. The hard cases they brought to Moses, but they judged every small case themselves. Moses heeded his father-in-law's advice, and it was God-fearing advice. Some fathers out there are some fathers out there, or some men that are in a position where they can be a fatherly influence, that give bad advice. They don't give God-fearing advice because they're not God-fearing men. I've seen and experienced a lot of men who are in a position of having father-like influence or fatherly-like influence and using it for selfish reasons. I've seen men who are in that position who ag on sons or men underneath them that look up to them as if they were a son to them to go get in fights, to go do violent things, to be a certain kind of man at home and not be a God-fearing husband. Or it doesn't just have to be sons, it can be influencing daughters as well. There are incredible negative things, and I've seen it over the course of my life, and I'm sure you have as well, of what the impact of a negative fatherly influence can do to anybody, but especially a young person who needs a good positive influence, not just as a parent, but as someone that is in the tribe, someone that is around them in their circle of trust. So we have to be men. We have to be willing to provide that God-fearing fatherly influence. And I'm so thankful at the church that we're at that I've got some of those around me. I know when my son comes around and is born and is, in his of age where he starts running around and he starts, being able to talk and things like that, I know there are God-fearing fatherly influences that are going to be around him. My father, my stepfather, my father-in-law, men at the River Church, my neighbors. There's a bunch of them I know that can go on. When I say neighbors, I mean like certain people in our community, like the Lees live just down the street from me. So do the Hayeses, the Cliftons. We're all kind of like mashed. A lot of us are kind of mashed together in this whole center thing. And I don't mean to leave anybody out per se, but I'm talking about having other God-fearing fatherly influences in your children's lives. Because they need those. Because sometimes as a child, I can attest to it, sometimes I wanted to hear what some other man thought. I wanted to hear what my Uncle Jerry thought. Because you're a child, sometimes you just naturally rebel. Or maybe you were just a good, perfect child and you didn't rebel. But I know I rebelled some. But when I would hear God-fearing fatherly influence in my life, I look back on it now and I'm like, man, thank God I had some godly men in my life. I think about my Uncle Jerry Hayes, making sure that I was in church as a teenager. I think about Randy Payne Sr., one of my best friend's fathers. These are people that are not necessarily blood kin, but people that are God-fearing men that had a fatherly type influence. If they told me like, hey man, you don't need to be doing that. That's a bad idea. That's not the way to be doing things. That's wrong. I knew they loved me, and they loved me enough to correct me, because young men need correction, young women need correction, children need correction, young adults, everybody. We all need some kind of correction, but you being in that God-fearing, fatherly influence position is one of the most important things. It is an incredible important thing, because you don't necessarily know the whole story behind some of these people that you can influence. Some of these people that you might have an influence over might be people who, you think their dad's a good person, but maybe he has struggles. He's a man, he's sinful, he's imperfect, he's got shortcomings, and he's got pitfalls and ways he comes up short. You might fill the gap for something that their dad just either doesn't have time to do or just doesn't do. You never know. You really never know. But one thing's for sure, I see the results, and you can see it too. If you look in culture, you look at the way things are going in our nation, you look at the way things are going in our churches, the number one thing that the devil, I believe, has attacked is the family. One of the biggest things the devil's attacked, and he's attacked it pretty well. He's doing a pretty bang up job, I would say, of attacking the family. And one of the things you have to do when you attack the family is you got to knock out the patriarch. You got to knock out that father. You got to knock out that God-fearing, God-appointed head of the household. You got to knock him out. If you knock him out, the rest of the family trickles on down. That's why it's so important. In whatever time is left, in whatever time we have left on this earth, whether you're 40, 50, 60, 70, you're in your 30s, whatever time is left allotted for you, I would humbly pray, if you are an old enough man, if you are an old enough man, whether you got nephews, nieces, or you got kids at your church, kids that you're around, teenagers that you're around, whatever have you, they don't need you. And this came out in another sermon of mine. I talked about your coworkers at work don't need people to stand around and tell dirty jokes with them. They need someone that's willing to minister to them. These people that are in your life, that are younger than you, these young teenagers, these young adults, these kids, they don't need another person your age to play with them. I guarantee you, they got enough friends. They got siblings. Most of them got siblings. They got other kids they play with at church, or they got other friends. That's not what they need you for. It's fun to do that sometimes, but that's not what they need you to do. They need you to be willing to stand up and be that godly influence in their life that's like, hey man, when your mom tells you to do this, you need to be doing it. This is why you need to be doing it. This is why you need to be listening to your mom. It's one of the things I had to learn, part of being Uncle Tyler. I got all these nieces and nephews on my wife's side, and I love them all to death. And one of the things that I've had to make sure and do is not sit there and undercut a parent. If they want to go do something, what's the first thing I do? I don't sit there and just go, yeah, let's go do it. I'm like, let's check with your mama or check with your daddy. Let's make sure it's okay, because we don't usurp their authority. Their parents are the authority over them. You don't sit there and, try to undercut them. And if their parents say no, then you know what? By God, that's what they said. That's what it's going to be. You don't sit there and run around and try to be the cool uncle or the cool aunt and just run around the parents' authority. But you sit there and respect their authority. You teach their kids that, hey, your parents' authority is to be respected. Your parents are to be honored. I honor your parents. You should honor them too. Whether they hear that or not, who knows? But that's what we need to be doing. We need to be providing that godly influence, and especially on this Father's Day, I would point to it being a God-fearing fatherly influence. We need God-fearing fathers. We need fathers who fear God so much that they will do things in the way that they are supposed to be done, in the way that God taught us to do, that they will respect the mother of their child, and they won't sit there and go against God's word when it comes to those things. Being that God-fearing fatherly influence, because it is increasingly becoming less and less. Fathers have been pushed out of any kind of position of influence in the secular world. Fathers are not seen as any kind of authoritative figure. Fathers are more seen in these movies and these TV shows and these other things of influences. Dad is usually seen as some clueless moron who doesn't know a darn thing, whose authority isn't to be respected at all. And that is not the way God designed the family. God designed the family for man to be the God-appointed head of the family. And the most important thing that a man needs to be as the head of a family is a God-fearing man. So on this Father's Day, as we look out, and dads, I know it's a lot to put on you. It's a lot more to put on you than just sitting in the recliner watching the Atlanta Braves play. I like doing that. But it is a responsibility that we must take seriously. It is a responsibility that we must take seriously, because time is of the essence. So I humbly pray for you men, whether you're a young man in your 20s, someone in your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, your 60s, your 70s, I don't care what the number is. If you've got an opportunity to be a God-fearing fatherly influence, I humbly pray that you would take that as a badge of honor and that you would take that seriously. Because there is some child, there's some kid, there's some young adult, there might be a 30-something adult in your life that you know that needs you to be that God-fearing, fatherly influence. They're out there somewhere. You might walk by them at church every Sunday, but they're there. You might walk by them every day at work, but they're there. You might see them at Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthday parties, and family functions, but they need you there. A lot of my God-fearing fatherly influences have been some of the ones that are also in my own family. I'm talking about uncles, I'm talking grandpas, sometimes cousins. They are needed. You are needed. You matter. You are important. And you need to be carrying out this work. It is what we are called to do as being God-fearing men. I thank you so much for listening to my message, and just thank you, everybody that watched in. God bless you. Hope you had a great Father's Day, and I'm looking forward to next year when I'll be a father in person. So I'm looking forward to that. But God bless you guys. Thank you for listening in.